Good morning, philosophers. So far in this course, we've asked ourselves a variety of questions about what we owe, morally speaking, to other human beings. I think it is fitting to conclude this course with a lecture devoted to non-human animals. I think it's a fair guess that when our descendants, a few generations from now, look back on life in the 20th and early 21st centuries, among the practices that will appear in retrospect hardest to justify, indeed to comprehend, is our treatment of non-human animals, especially in the context of the global meat industry. The facts about human meat consumption are truly staggering. Every single day, more than 200 million land animals, that is, cattle, pigs, lambs, hogs, chickens, ducks, and turkeys, are killed for food around the world. That amounts to 73 billion land animals per year. Let me put that figure in context for you. The total number of all human beings killed in all the wars of the 20th century is roughly 108 million. So every single day, we're killing almost twice as many land animals for food as the number of human beings killed in all the wars of the past 120 years. In the US alone, approximately 10 billion land animals are killed per year. This Thanksgiving alone, it is estimated that Americans will consume upwards of 46 million turkeys. If we include in the totals caught and farmed fish and wild animals, the total number of animals killed and eaten worldwide rises to 3 billion per day, and over 1 trillion animals a year. Furthermore, as most of you know, the large majority of land animals that are killed for food are factory farmed. In the United States, more than 90%. In factory farms, animals are often held in extremely cramped conditions that do not permit them to lie down or even move about. To quote from an information brochure by PETA, factory-farmed animals are often crammed by the thousands into windowless sheds or stuffed into wire cages, metal crates. Animals raised on factory farms will never raise their families, root around in the soil, build nests, or do anything that is natural and important to them. Most won't even feel the warmth of the sun on their backs or breathe fresh air until the day they're loaded onto trucks headed for slaughterhouses. Since I believe that words can only imperfectly convey to you the conditions in factory farms, I will now show you a brief video filmed undercover by the American Humane Society at one of the plants of Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer in the world. I warn you that these are hard images to watch, but I think that we all, especially the meat eaters amongst us, should not avert our eyes from this reality.
What we found are extraordinarily inhumane conditions at Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer in the entire world. I still remember the first time I ever laid eyes on a gestation crate facility and seeing the helplessness of these animals who have done nothing to deserve the fate that they're enduring. Suffering inside of these crates is just absolutely devastating. The Humane Society of the United States has investigated one of Smithfield's breeding operations. This facility represents what gestation crate confinement is. Open wounds, pressure sores, infections, bleeding gums from biting the bars so much, and these animals aren't even being cared for with individualized veterinary attention. Regardless of how the system is managed, these pigs are barely able to move even an inch their entire lives. They're unable to walk around, to turn around. It causes them to quite literally go insane.
Given the often horrifying reality of factory farming, a growing number of people have come around to the view that factory farming is morally wrong because of the suffering it causes to animals throughout their lives. However, many among those who object to factory farming believe that becoming a vegetarian or vegan isn't the only permissible alternative to eating meat from animals from factory farms. Another alternative is to eat animals that have been reared without being caused to suffer, perhaps on free-range farms, and that have been killed with minimal pain and fear. Following Jeff McMahan, let us refer to such a more humane practice of raising animals for food as benign carnivorism. The aim of McMahan's article is to figure out whether a practice of benign carnivorism could be morally justified. The interest of this investigation is twofold, I think. First, for those of us who desire to continue eating meat because we like the taste of meat or for cultural or health reasons, it is obviously a question of great ethical relevance whether our existing practices of rearing and killing animals for consumption could be reformed in a morally acceptable direction. If the farm animals we kill and eat have been reared without being caused to suffer and have been killed with minimal pain and fear, would this make a practice of rearing animals for food morally permissible? But second, suppose the answer to this first question is no. Suppose it turns out that even benign carnivorism is ultimately morally unjustifiable. Well, then that teaches us something important as well. It teaches us that a fortiori, our prevailing practices of factory farming, which we said are unquestionably worse than benign carnivorism, can't be justified either. We should then become vegetarians or vegans, or perhaps limit ourselves to the consumption of animals that have died of natural causes or in traffic accidents. Before we go on, let's meet the hero of today's lecture, my dear colleague and friend, Jeff McMahan. Here's a picture of Jeff. Oh dear, it seems I've got my pictures mixed up. That, of course, isn't Jeff, but Robert Redford. This is Jeff. The resemblance is pretty striking, no? Look at them side by side. They're practically twins, aren't they? Anyway, besides gracing the silver screen in Hollywood, Jeff McMahan, born 1954, is the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at Oxford University, perhaps the most illustrious chair of moral philosophy in the world. Incidentally, Jeff McMahan is also the first American to hold that post. He's done pioneering work on population ethics, the ethics of killing, and on just war theory. His two main books are The Ethics of Killing, Problems at the Margins of Life, which to my mind is the single best philosophical study of the ethics of killing and letting die, where the moral status of the individual killed or let die is uncertain, that is, in cases like abortion at the very beginning of life, or in cases like physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia at its very end. And his second book, Killing in War, published in 2009, which has led to a veritable renaissance of philosophical work on just war theory. But back to today's paper. The main question of McMahan's article, sarcastically titled, Eating Animals the Nice Way, is this. Is benign carnivorism morally permissible? Now, as I already said, McMahan is clear that the practice of benign carnivorism, or BC for short, would be a vast improvement on the horrors of factory farming. But the question remains, is benign carnivorism actually morally permissible? For although, by assumption, benign carnivorism does not involve the infliction of great suffering on animals, it does involve killing animals very prematurely, around 1/10 of the way through their natural lifespan. once farm animals have reached their full size and are ready for consumption, it simply is not economical to continue to feed and take care of them. Let's consider a first unpromising justification of benign carnivorism. As McMahan notes, the most common reason why many people tend to think that benign carnivorism is justified is that they believe, perhaps inchoately, that while animal suffering matters, animal lives don't matter, or at least don't matter very much. In other words, according to such people, we're morally required to avoid being cruel to animals by causing them avoidable pain and suffering, such as they would suffer on factory farms. But there are no strong moral reasons, they believe, against killing animals for food. However, this common justification of benign carnivorism strikes McMahan as unpromising for two reasons. For a start, the view in question seems questionably coherent. It seems to McMahan that if animal suffering matters, animal death must also matter. How so? Well, look at it this way. It is agreed by proponents of this view that an animal has an interest in avoiding suffering in the future. Future suffering would be bad for the animal. Moreover, it is agreed that this fact gives us moral reasons of a certain strength to avoid causing the animal suffering. But then, by symmetry of reasoning, it seems hard to deny that if future suffering would be bad for the animal, future happiness or pleasure would be good for the animal, and that we therefore have moral reason of some strength not to deprive the animal of this future happiness. The animal has an interest in its future happiness, enjoying the pleasures of food or sex, feeling the sun on its back, breathing the fresh air, spending time with its family, and so on. But that is exactly what the premature killing of the animal prevents. Premature death deprives an animal of the future happiness or pleasure that it could have experienced. So if there's a moral objection to causing animals to suffer in the future, there must also, it seems, be a moral objection to depriving them of future happiness by killing them. Indeed, and this is the second point, the thought that an animal's future happiness matters is actually presupposed by many of our ways of treating animals. For only if an animal's future happiness matters could it offset an animal's present or future suffering, as we tend to think it does. For example, we often subject pets to somewhat painful but life-saving medical treatments. Doing so, we think, is justified by the fact that it is overall in the interest of the pet to undergo some amount of suffering in exchange for the goods that the rest of its life would contain. In sum, the attempt to justify benign carnivorism by claiming that while the avoidance of animal suffering matters, the premature killing of animals is simply of no moral significance, that seems implausible. Because it deprives animals of many years of life that could have been worth living, it seems that benign carnivorism still requires moral justification. Let us next consider a more promising and interesting argument, what we'll call, following Jeff McMahan, the benefit argument. Now, this argument has been in circulation for a long time, or at least versions of it. In other writings, Jeff McMahan is fond of quoting the words of Leslie Stephen, a Victorian author and the father of Virginia Woolf. Stephen writes, "The pig has a stronger interest than anyone in the demand for bacon. If all the world were Jewish, there would be no pigs at all." The same idea occurs a century earlier in the conversation of Dr. Johnson, the 18th century English writer. "Animals we use for our benefit," Dr. Johnson remarked, "are recompensed by existence. If they were not useful to man and therefore protected by him, they would not be nearly so numerous." Now, instead of saying protected, Johnson might have said caused to exist. So, in his paper, McMahan sets out to provide a more precise and rigorous statement of this venerable argument. The argument is based on three main assumptions about a possible practice of benign carnivorism. Two of these assumptions are moral or evaluative, and one is empirical. First, the argument assumes it is overall good for the animals reared through benign carnivorism to be caused to exist and to be given good lives. Now, this assumption, McMahan notes, is not equivalent to claiming that it is better for an animal to exist with a happy life than to have never existed. As I discussed in my last lecture on the non-identity problem, there are many philosophers who find such a claim dubiously coherent. To suggest that it is better for an animal or person to exist than never to have existed, they reason, is to suggest that it would have been worse for that person never to have existed. But this, they claim, does not make sense. If the individual in question never exists, there is no individual for whom non-existence is worse, and consequently no one for whom existence would have been better. Individuals who never exist, they think, can be neither the subjects of fortune or misfortune. There is, however, a way of putting the same point that does not encounter such conceptual difficulties. As Jeff McMahan points out, it is both coherent and plausible that being caused to exist with a life worth living can be good for an animal or a person in a non-comparative sense, namely just insofar as the intrinsically good elements of the animal's life more than compensate for the intrinsically bad elements. And this can be true despite the fact that the outcome in which the animal does not exist would not have been bad or worse for her. So, in this non-comparative sense, it is good for a contented farm animal to exist and to be given a good life. It is something that the animal, were it capable of this thought, would have reason to be glad about. And because bringing an animal or person into existence can be good or bad for her in this non-comparative sense, it is also plausible to speak of acts of creation as benefiting and harming those whom they create. So that's the argument's first premise, or first assumption rather. It is overall good for the animals reared through benign carnivorism to be caused to exist and to be given good lives. However, and this is the argument's second assumption, though creating contented farm animals through a practice of benign carnivorism would be good for these animals, we have no moral duty to benefit animals by causing them to exist. Just as most of us believe that we don't have a moral obligation to create more people just because their lives would be happy ones, so too it seems we don't have a duty to create contented farm animals just because doing so would benefit them. Indeed, and this is the argument's third assumption, as a matter of fact, we wouldn't cause additional animals to exist even with good lives unless we were motivated by self-interest to do so, for example, so that we could later kill and eat them. But for our carnivorous designs, most farm animals would never exist in the first place. So, given these three basic assumptions, we can now make the following argument in support of benign carnivorism. So, let A be any animal that is reared through a practice of benign carnivorism and later killed for consumption. So here then is the argument. First premise. Despite its premature death, it is overall good for A to exist with a life worth living. Second premise. Without benign carnivorism, A would never have existed, and this would have been a permissible outcome. Hence, intermediary conclusion, A is a net beneficiary of benign carnivorism. Fourth premise. The fact that A is a net beneficiary of benign carnivorism morally offsets the killing of the animal as part of a practice of benign carnivorism, making it morally permissible. Since this is a crucial premise of the argument, let's give it a name. Let's call it the offsetting claim. Hence, the argument concludes, it is permissible to kill A as part of a practice of benign carnivorism. Now, If this benefit argument is sound, a practice of benign carnivorism would be morally permissible. Indeed, we can say something stronger than that. Benign carnivorism would not only represent a permissible alternative to vegetarianism and veganism, it might actually be morally better, since it confers significant benefits on many animals that they otherwise would never have had, since in the absence of a practice of benign carnivorism, these animals would never have been created in the first place. So the argument obviously deserves very close scrutiny. Now, there's a rather obvious line of objection to the benefit argument that I'm sure will occur to many of you right away. Could the same kind of argument not be applied to human persons, you might wonder? So we might, for example, create happy new people only to be able to kill them during adulthood, for example, in order to use their organs for transplantation. Now, this thought experiment is given in an indelible literary treatment by Katsuo Ishiguro in his novel Never Let Me Go, which was later turned into a movie starring Keira Knightley. But obviously, the objection continues. Such a practice of creating additional happy humans for the purpose of killing them in early adulthood and harvesting their organs, well, this seems clearly morally impermissible. So, if a parallel argument applied to human beings entails a conclusion that strikes us as clearly false, does this not also cast doubt on the benefit argument for benign carnivorism? McMahan in his paper considers such a line of response to the benefit argument. But on reflection, this way of dismissing the benefit argument strikes him as a little too quick. Our reasons not to kill persons, McMahan contends, may be different, either wholly or in part, from the reasons not to kill animals. In particular, persons may have certain rights that animals lack, and these rights may prohibit killing persons for their organs, even if they had been given good lives, only in order to later kill them and harvest their organs. By contrast, McMahan thinks it is less plausible that animals have the same kinds of rights against being killed. Why does he think this? Well, for one thing, the view that animals have rights against being killed, just like humans do, seems at odds with our intuitions about certain cases. For example, it seems permissible to kill one chimpanzee to save 2 human 5-year-olds. But it would be impermissible to kill one human 5-year-old to save even 2 human 5-year-olds, as in our organ harvesting case from earlier in the semester. Persons, we think, have rights that act as side constraints on the maximization of utility. Now, if this pair of intuitions are both correct, then animals don't have the same rights against being killed that we have. But could animals perhaps have weaker rights? McMahan's response to this thought goes as follows, and I quote, "This view is hard to reconcile with the nature of rights. A right of a given type, in this case a right not to be killed, is generally held to be invariant in strength among all those who possess it." End quote. Does this strike you as a decisive reply? In the interest of time, I won't go into this question today, but this is definitely something to chew on further. Let's take it up in our final town hall. In the meanwhile, let's move on to a different objection to the benefit argument. McMahan is so quick to dismiss the rights-based response to the benefit argument because, in any case, he thinks there's a different but very powerful way of objecting to this argument for benign carnivorism. This objection appeals not to the rights of non-human animals, but to their interests. Even if non-human animals don't have rights, McMahan reasons, they certainly have interests. And these interests constrain what it is permissible for us to do to them. This thought strikes us as completely natural when thinking about cruelty towards animals. It's morally wrong to torture an animal just for fun, most of us think, because this is bad for the animal. The animal, as a sentient creature, matters morally. It is quite unlike an inanimate object, like a stone that we may kick or hit at will. But just as the interests of animals place moral constraints on cruelty towards them, so too the interests of animals should make us think twice before killing an animal to eat it. Just consider, says McMahan, the interests that are at stake in a typical episode of benign carnivorism. Let's suppose that one pig would provide meat for one meal for each of 20 people. The interests at stake, then, are the interests of each of 20 people in having the difference in pleasure between one meal with meat and a similar meal without meat, made entirely from vegetable products. That's what we, the would-be carnivores, would lose out on if we prohibited the eating of meat. But on the other side of the equation is the pig's interest in all the pleasure, all the happiness it would have had over the course of many years if we hadn't killed it prematurely. And that's what the pig would gain if we prohibited benign carnivorism. Now, looked at in this way, McMahan thinks the choice is not even close. Even if we give greater weight to the interests of people over non-human animals, and even if we accept the thought that animals may, on the whole, have a lower capacity for well-being than human beings because they lack access to certain dimensions of human well-being like achievement, creativity, knowledge, aesthetic appreciation, and so on, even granting all those things, it seems that the pig's interest in survival far outweighs that of the 20 people in eating it. As McMahan writes, I quote, "It seems unlikely that the interest that 20 people each have in experiencing a few minutes of slightly greater pleasure could outweigh all the goods that an animal's life might contain over several years." End quote. So, if these considerations from the animal's interests are sound, then I think they open the door to a new way of resisting the benefit argument. What I'm about to say goes beyond the arguments contained in McMahan's text. So, consider a hypothetical farm animal, A, that we could create. We have three relevant options with regard to A. Option 1, don't create A. Option 2, create A, but kill it prematurely to eat it. Option 3, create A and let it live out its natural lifespan. Now, the benefit argument focuses on the following three facts. It is morally permissible to choose option 1. We're under no moral obligation to create more farm animals. Option 2 confers a benefit on A, a life that is worth living, albeit truncated by premature death, which option 1 does not confer on A. Thirdly, we would not actually choose option 3 if this was our only alternative to option 1. We don't create farm animals just for the heck of it. So based on these three facts, the benefit argument concludes that option 2 must be permissible. Option 2 confers a benefit on A that option 1, which we said was already permissible, would not have provided. Moreover, if 2 wasn't chosen, such a benefit would not actually have been provided. We wouldn't actually choose option 3 if this was our only alternative to option 1. So given this, we might wonder, how could option 2 not be permissible? But this argument, we'll now see, overlooks 2 further facts. We've already argued that, given a choice between killing an animal prematurely in order to eat it and letting it live out its natural lifespan, it is morally wrong to kill it prematurely. The animal's interest in not being prematurely killed and eaten morally outweigh our interest in eating A. Moreover, it is quite possible for us not to kill the animal prematurely. So given these 2 facts, it seems that, conditional on making the choice to create an animal in the first place, it would be wrong to kill it prematurely in order to eat it. Specifically, we can't simply appeal to the fact that we won't choose option 3 in order to justify choosing option 2 instead. That's just saying, in effect, since I won't do what I'm obligated to do, I'm justified in doing something else instead. And that is, of course, terrible reasoning. Okay, but now a proponent of the benefit argument might interject. Whoa, man, not so fast. Aren't you simply begging the question against my view? In asserting that in a choice between options 2 and 3, it is wrong to choose option 2, aren't you simply ignoring the main claim of my benefit argument, namely the offsetting claim, which says that the fact that animal A is a net beneficiary of benign carnivorism renders the killing of A, as part of a practice of benign carnivorism, morally permissible? Now, I'll grant you, he says, that in the case of a wild animal, which does not owe its existence to a practice of benign carnivorism, it would be wrong to kill it rather than let it live out its natural lifespan. But that's not what we're talking about in the case of farm animals. The farm animal only exists with a life that is worth living because we choose to create it. And that is not something we were required to do. So the fact that by choosing option 2, we would be conferring benefits on the farm animal that we didn't have to confer, we could have permissibly chosen option 1 instead, this fact makes it permissible to kill it prematurely, rather than to let it live out its natural lifespan. In effect, the proponent of the benefit argument is saying, if the choice was just between killing an animal and letting it live, as in the case of the wild animal, it would be wrong to kill the animal. If, however, you only reach that choice point because you previously made the decision to create the animal, which is something that you weren't morally required to do, so that all benefits which flow from this choice are benefits that you didn't have to provide, then this makes it permissible for you to kill the animal in order to eat it. Now, I want to pause here for a little thinking exercise. Do you think that the reasoning of the proponent of the benefit argument that I just went through, do you think that this reasoning is sound? Or can you see possible problems with it? Take a few minutes to consider your response. I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome back. Well, I'll tell you how I would respond to the question I posed to you. I think that we have reason to be quite skeptical of the reasoning of the proponent of the argument from benefit. To see this, consider the following analogy. Suppose there's a sick elephant right in front of me, dying of a disease. Fortunately, I have the means to save the elephant's life. Indeed, I have 2 medicines that would both do the trick, and I could give either of them to the elephant at no cost to myself. But there's the following difference. If I give the elephant medicine A, he will survive his disease. However, as a side effect of receiving medicine A, the elephant will go into extremely painful spasms for about 2 hours. If I give the elephant medicine B, on the other hand, he will swiftly recover from his disease without any adverse side effects whatsoever. Suppose, however, that I am a sadist who enjoys watching the elephant's painful spasms. Giving the elephant medicine B would deprive me of this sadistic pleasure. Nonetheless, most of us think giving medicine B is clearly the right thing to do here. It would be wrong to make the elephant suffer painful spasms just for my sadistic pleasure. But suppose we now change the case. The elephant isn't, in fact, right in front of me. He's on the other side of a raging river. And crossing the river is pretty risky. In fact, it's so risky that, all things considered, crossing to the other side to save the elephant is not something I'm morally required to do. It would be morally praiseworthy of me to brave the danger and to go, but it would be permissible for me to stay put, even though the elephant will then die, which we assume would be worse for the elephant than receiving either medicine. However, suppose I do take the decision to cross the river. I make it to the other side, and now, once again, I'm standing in front of the elephant and have to choose whether to give him medicine A or medicine B. Does the fact that I have only reached this choice point because I previously took a decision that I didn't have to take namely to cross the river, does this now give me license to give the elephant drug A rather than drug B in order to satisfy my sadism? To me, it seems that the answer to this question is clearly not. I didn't have to cross the river on account of the danger. However, having made it safely across, I now, as before, have an obligation to give the elephant medicine B. This is true, I would say, even if I would not have crossed the river except for my sadistic desire to give the elephant medicine A and to watch him suffer. That I didn't have to put myself in a position to benefit the elephant by saving his life does not offset the wrongness of saving his life in a way that causes him gratuitous suffering. So suppose all this is correct. Then I think it also gives us reason to be pretty skeptical of the central premise of the benefit argument, namely the offsetting claim. The fact that we didn't have to create a farm animal with a life worth living does not then offset the wrongness of killing the animal prematurely, just to indulge our comparatively trivial desire to eat its flesh. So it looks like we now have a non-question begging way of resisting the argument from benefit. On reflection, the argument's key premise, the offsetting claim, appears false, and hence the argument is a dud. Let's move on. Even if the benefit argument fails, there is one further argument in support of benign carnivorism that we must consider. This is what might be dubbed, following McMahan, the euthanasia argument for benign carnivorism. Suppose that farmers have caused animals to exist and reared them humanely up to this point, with the aim of being able to kill them once they reach maturity and to sell their meat. Now, what exactly should be done with these animals if they're not killed? The euthanasia argument picks up from here. Stated in premise-conclusion form, it goes as follows. First premise. The farmers have no duty to continue to support the animals. They could permissibly turn them loose, the argument asserts. However, second premise. It would be worse for farm animals to be turned loose than to be killed painlessly, since most of them would be unable to survive for long in the wild and would die painfully by being hit by a car or through starvation or disease. Third premise. Given that killing the animals painlessly is better for the animals than another permissible option, namely turning them loose, killing the animals is permissible. It is justified as a form of euthanasia, or mercy killing. However, fourth premise, if we may kill farm animals for their own good, rather than turning them loose, then surely it's also permissible to sell and consume their meat once they're dead. Surely morality does not require us to let their meat simply go to waste rather than feeding people with it. But if all these premises are true, then aren't we led back to the conclusion that benign carnivorism is permissible after all? I think it's time for another thinking exercise. Do you think that the euthanasia argument, as we've just reconstructed it, succeeds in justifying a practice of benign carnivorism? If not, where in the argument do you think it goes wrong? Please take at least 2 minutes to ponder these questions. I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome back. Well, I think there are in fact a number of points at which the euthanasia argument can be convincingly challenged. Let me mention just 2 of them. First, how plausible, we might wonder, is premise 1, the claim that farmers have no duty to continue to support the animals they created as part of a practice of benign carnivorism? Don't we have a special responsibility for these animals in virtue of having created them? As McMahan writes on page 72, to cause an individual to exist in a vulnerable and dependent condition is arguably to make oneself liable to certain duties of care. It seems wrong to cause an individual that is incapable of surviving in the wild to exist and then to abandon it in the wild. One must either refrain from causing it to exist or else arrange for it to have the care it requires once it exists." End quote. So, premise one of the euthanasia argument seems at least open to challenge. On the other hand, the proponents of the euthanasia argument do have some possible lines of response. So she might, for instance, challenge the claim that causing an individual to exist in a dependent condition in general grounds a duty of support. As we saw a couple of lectures ago when discussing Judith Thomson's article, such a claim would have rather counterintuitive implications for the permissibility of abortion. Assuming we begin to exist before birth, the claim implies that a pregnant woman has a special duty to support the individual she is caused to exist in a dependent condition, and that would challenge the permissibility of abortion. Now, many people find that a very unwelcome conclusion. So it pays, I think, to see if there's a different way of resisting the euthanasia argument. And there is, I think. For even if all the premises of the euthanasia argument are correct, I think it proves less than its proponents imagine. In particular, I question that the argument would justify an ongoing practice of rearing and killing animals for meat, as opposed to giving us a one-off permission to kill and eat the legacy animals that are left over from our previous practice of rearing animals for meat, before then ceasing the practice. It's one thing to say, surely, that once you're in a situation where farm animals exist, it is permissible to kill and eat them if that is your best available option. It is another thing to say that it is permissible to keep getting into a situation where our best available option is to kill the animals. Compare. It is one thing to say that if I've gotten myself into a situation where I can't pay my employees in full because I've gambled away my money, my best remaining option may be to pay them whatever little I can. I mean, it's still better for them than paying them nothing at all, right? But it doesn't follow at all from this that it's permissible for me to keep gambling away my money and then paying my workers only very little. I have reason not to keep getting into such dire straits. Now, if this criticism is on the mark, then even if we accept the controversial first premise of the euthanasia argument, the argument would still only show that it would be permissible to painlessly kill and eat the last generation of farm animals presently alive before phasing out the practice. It couldn't justify an ongoing practice of benign carnivorism. So, in this lecture, we have surveyed 3 arguments in support of a practice of benign carnivorism. The argument from the claim that while animal suffering matters, animal deaths do not. The argument from benefit, and the euthanasia argument. On closer inspection, we found all 3 arguments to be wanting. So, must we then conclude that there is no conceivable practice of creating animals for the purpose of consumption that is morally justifiable? Must we all become vegetarians? Or if we do consume meat, must we limit ourselves to eating the occasional roadkill or wild animals that have died of natural causes? Well, perhaps not quite. McMahan ends his article with some intriguing speculations. As so often, technology provides a possible way out. There could, in principle, be a way of achieving the aims of benign carnivorism, McMahan suggests, which wouldn't involve any act of killing. Suppose we could genetically engineer food animals that would live just long enough to reach full size, but which, as soon as they attain maturity, would then keel over and die in good health. Eureka! We wouldn't need to kill them. we could just wait for them to die naturally and then collect their bodies to prepare them for human consumption. Would such a system for procuring our beef or pork or chicken be morally permissible? Well, on reflection, it's a bit hard to see why not. For in creating and causing these animals to exist with genetically predetermined early deaths, we wouldn't be causing them to have shorter lives than they could otherwise have. Why? Well, if we cause animals to exist in this way, with genetic modifications, these animals will be different individuals from those who would have existed had we continued to bring animals into existence in the normal way, through ordinary breeding. So in causing animals to exist in this way, we wouldn't be doing anything at any point that would be worse for them or harm them in a morally relevant sense. After all, but for such a practice of genetically engineering short-lived animals, these particular animals would never have existed at all. Now, you will of course recognize this as yet another instance of the non-identity problem, which I discussed in my previous lecture. At the same time, this thought experiment raises a puzzle, and I'll conclude my lecture with this. Suppose we find this genetic engineering variant of benign carnivorism ethically appealing. But now again, consider a parallel case involving people, a variant of our earlier Katsuo Ishiguro scenario, but this time involving genetic engineering. Most of us, I think, would not deem it morally permissible to genetically engineer human beings who would die of natural causes at a young age, but with healthy organs which could then be used for transplantation. Yet this too would not be worse for these persons. It would be good for them to exist, and we would not be causing them to have shorter lives than they could have. Now, we encountered a possible explanation for this moral intuition in our last lecture, namely Parfit's principle Q. Even though genetically engineering a shorter-lived type of humans wouldn't be worse for anyone who ever lives, it would nonetheless be wrong according to principle Q, because it would involve causing individuals with less good lives to exist, rather than numerically different individuals with better lives that aren't cut short in their prime. However, if this is the right thing to say when human beings are involved, then what, if anything, can justify our divergent intuition about the case involving animals? Is there a principled explanation why a principle like Parfit's Q is appropriate when thinking about persons, but not when it comes to non-human animals? Or must we, in the end, revise our intuitions about one case or the other to achieve consistency? I look forward to puzzling over these questions with you at our final town hall.